The red icons bled across the tactical display like a virus. On the holographic map filling the center of the Tactical Operations Center, the friendly blue chevrons of Chalk 4 were static, pinned down in a dry wadi 1,000 meters beyond the wire of forward operating base apex. They were being systematically dismantled. Colonel Madsen's voice was a low, serrated growl, worn down by 48 hours of sustained contact and the grinding futility of his position. "Where is that Spectre? I need guns. Now." "Negative, sir," a communications tech replied, his voice thin and reedy with tension. "Spectre's on station over the Karangal, hard-decked by this weather system. Nothing can get through. The entire valley is socked in. It's a complete brownout from ground level to 20,000 feet. The storm had a name. The Shamal, a seasonal wind, but this was no ordinary gale. It was a churning wall of sand and grit moving at 80 knots, a phenomenon that had swallowed the horizon hours ago and was now beginning to chew on the edges of the FOB itself. It had grounded every asset in the sector. It had cut them off. Madsen slammed a fist on the console, not in theatrical anger, but with the dead-end frustration of a man watching his soldiers die on a screen he couldn't influence. "Then get me drones. Reaper, Predator, I don't care. I need eyes. I need something." "Same problem, Colonel," the tech said, shrinking under the commander's glare. "The sand is too dense. It's like flying through concrete. We lost a Scan Eagle an hour ago. The particulates strip the turbine blades and scour the optics. Nothing is getting in or out." The room was a pressure cooker of hushed orders and the incessant crackle of dying hopes over the radio. The feed from Chalk 4's last transmitting helmet cam was a chaotic mosaic of dust, muzzle flashes, and the desperate, heaving chest of a soldier trying to breathe through sand-clogged air. Then it went dark. A collective, silent flinch went through the TOC. In the back corner of the room, away from the frantic energy of the command staff, Major Eva Rostova stood perfectly still. She wasn't part of the command element. She was transient, a ferry pilot tasked with moving a pair of aging A-10 Warthogs to Bagram for decommissioning. She was a glorified delivery driver, a footnote on the day's flight manifest. Her uniform was crisp, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She had been observing the unfolding disaster for the last 20 minutes, her gaze fixed on the storm density readings and wind shear data flickering on a secondary monitor. She listened to the clipped, desperate radio calls from the ground. A voice, young and cracking with fear. "They're flanking us? Coming over the ridge. We can't." The transmission dissolved into a burst of static that sounded like a scream. Madsen's face was pale, his jaw set like granite. He was a good commander, trapped by an impossible situation. He was about to make the call no commander ever wants to make, writing off a unit as a combat loss. The air in the TOC grew thick with the unspoken. Eva pushed off the wall. Her movement was so slight, so economical that it barely registered. She walked past the gesticulating staff officers and stopped a few feet from Colonel Madsen. She waited without speaking. He finally noticed her, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. He didn't know her name, only that she was the pilot who had been a quiet, unobtrusive presence for the past 2 days, waiting for the weather to clear for her outbound flight. "What is it, Major? Can't you see we're in the middle of something?" Her voice was low, calm, a stark contrast to the room's frantic pitch. "Colonel, the storm has a stable inversion layer at 900 feet. The wind shear is predictable if you know how to read the pressure gradients. There's a corridor." Madsen turned fully to face her, his expression a mask of pure incredulity. The room fell silent around them, the background chatter ceasing as every ear tuned in to this bizarre interruption. He looked at her rank, then at her face, searching for some sign she was either a fool or insane. "A corridor? Through that? Major, my most experienced pilots have refused to even attempt a takeoff. My assets are grounded for a reason. It is not possible. Your Spectre pilots are flying at 15,000 feet, trying to look down." Eva stated, not arguing, but correcting. "They can't penetrate the ceiling. The only way in is from the side, underneath the worst of the particle density." A junior captain, emboldened or simply desperate, chimed in. Sir, maybe she's right. If there's any chance. Madsen cut him off with a glacial stare. A chance for what, Captain? To lose another aircraft? To send a pilot on a suicide run for a feel-good story? The battle for Chalk 4 is lost. Our focus now is the perimeter defense of this base. His words were brutal, pragmatic, and final. He turned his back on Eva, a clear and absolute dismissal. Get me a muster of all remaining sector assets. I want a full defensive posture. Now. He looked past her, his eyes scanning the faces of his own people, the ones he trusted. He saw her as an outsider, an unknown variable in an equation that already had too many. Her presence was an annoyance, a distraction from the grim calculus of loss he was now forced to perform. Major, this TOC is for operational staff only. I suggest you find the officer's mess and wait this out like everyone else. The dismissal was as sharp and clean as a guillotine. It wasn't just a rejection of her idea. It was a rejection of her very presence, of her right to even have an opinion. For a moment, the only sound was the howling of the real wind outside, a mournful sound that echoed the hopelessness inside the command center. Eva didn't flinch. Her face remained a neutral mask, but something in her eyes, a deep, cold fire, hardened. She held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, a silent challenge that he refused to acknowledge. Then, with a barely perceptible nod that was more for herself than for him, she turned and walked out of the TOC. The heavy door hissed shut behind her, leaving Madsen to his maps and his ghosts. He had already forgotten her. The wind on the flight line was a physical entity. It wasn't just blowing. It was a solid wall of sand that hit with the force of a pressure washer, scouring skin and stealing breath. Eva leaned into it, her head down, her body a rigid line against the gale. The world was a maelstrom of brown, visibility reduced to less than 20 feet. The air tasted of grit and smelled of ozone and hot metal. Aluminum shelters groaned under the strain, and the percussive rattling of loose debris was a constant, chaotic drumbeat. She didn't head for the transient billets or the officer's mess. Her path was direct, unerring, toward the line of parked aircraft. She moved with a purpose that defied the storm's chaos. She found the revetment she was looking for, a C-shaped wall of sand-filled barriers protecting a single, hulking shape from the worst of the wind. It was an A-10C Thunderbolt II, an old warrior, scarred and stained. Its official designation was Hog 7, but it wore its history on its skin. The gray paint was faded and chipped, revealing older layers of green camouflage beneath. Patches of primer dotted its fuselage where it had been repaired and repaired again. It was one of the aircraft she was supposed to ferry out, a machine deemed too old, too costly to maintain. It was destined for the boneyard. A figure emerged from the lee of the landing gear, bundled in a heavy jacket and goggles. Sergeant Cole, the aircraft's crew chief. He was a wiry man in his late 40s with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands. He'd been watching her approach. He wasn't surprised. Figured you wouldn't be able to just sit there, Major, he yelled over the shriek of the wind. Eva pulled down the scarf covering her mouth. Cole, I need her ready. Full combat load. 30mm high-explosive incendiary. 6 Mavericks. Cluster bombs if you have them. Cole's eyes widened slightly behind his goggles. He didn't question the order. He didn't ask about clearance or authorization. He had been with this specific airframe for 7 years. He knew it, and in the 2 days Eva had been here, he had seen the way she looked at it, the way she walked around it, the way her hands traced the lines of the fuselage. He had seen the file, the real one, that had come with her transfer orders, before the sanitized version was sent to the FOB command. He knew who she was. The arming crews are hunkered down, ma'am. They won't come out in this. Then you and I will do it, Eva said. It wasn't a question. She stopped at the nose of the aircraft. Her gloved hand reached out and wiped away a thick layer of dust just below the cockpit. Underneath, faded but still visible, was a small, intricate painting of a winged woman in Norse armor, carrying a spear. A Valkyrie. Below it, Almost lost in the grime were 7 tiny, stenciled silhouettes of enemy tanks. Cole had painted the A-10 himself unofficially after her last tour. He knew the stories. He knew the call sign. "She's been sitting cold, Major," Cole shouted, his voice strained. "Pre-flight will take 20 minutes. "We have 10, Eva replied, already moving toward the ladder. She began her walk-around, a ritual of methodical checks. Her movements were fluid and precise, a stark contrast to the storm's fury. She didn't just look. She touched. Her bare hands ran over the seams of the titanium bathtub that encased the cockpit, feeling for any stress fractures. She checked the fan blades of the huge turbofan engines, her fingers tracing their edges, feeling for the pitting the sand had already caused. This was her true language, a silent communion with the machine. While she worked outside, Cole was inside the cockpit, flipping switches, bringing the beast to life. The auxiliary power unit whined, a high-pitched scream that cut through the wind's roar. One by one, the displays flickered on, bathing the cramped space in a green glow. Eva climbed the ladder and swung herself into the seat. The cockpit closed around her like a second skin. It was her sanctuary. Here, the chaos of the wind became a known variable, a set of data points on her display. She strapped herself in, the belts and harnesses clicking into place with familiar sounds. She pulled on her helmet, the world outside muting to a dull roar. The hiss of the oxygen system was a steady, calming rhythm. Cole's voice crackled in her headset, patched directly into the aircraft's comms. "Armaments loaded, Major, but the system's throwing a fault on Maverick number 3. Connections probably loose. This storm is hell on the electronics." Eva's fingers danced across the weapons control panel. "I can see it. It's a ghost reading. The pylon is fine." She didn't need a diagnostic computer to tell her that. She could feel it through the airframe, a subtle lack of resonance that told her the connection was solid. "Colonel Madsen is on the command net," Cole warned. "He's ordering all personnel to remain undercover. He's about to find out you're not in the mess hall." "Let him," Eva said, her voice flat. She initiated the engine start sequence. The right engine whined, caught, and settled into a low, hungry rumble that vibrated through her bones. Then the left. The entire 40,000-pound airframe trembled, awake and angry. She was no longer a ferry pilot. Madsen had dismissed Major Rostova. But it was Valkyrie who was strapping into the cockpit of Hog 7. And Valkyrie didn't need his permission. The tower's voice was frantic in her headset. "Unidentified aircraft, you are not cleared for taxi. I repeat, you are not cleared for taxi. Return to your revetment immediately." Eva ignored it. The A-10 lumbered out of its protective pen, a gray behemoth emerging into the churning brown sea of the storm. The sand blasted against the canopy with a sound like a million tiny hammers, a deafening, abrasive roar. On her heads-up display, the forward view was almost entirely opaque. She wasn't flying by sight. She was flying by instruments and instinct. "Major Rostova, this is Colonel Madsen." A new voice, hard as iron, cut through the channel. "What in God's name do you think you are doing? I am ordering you to stand down." "That is a direct order." Eva's thumb rested on the transmit button. She keyed the mic. "Colonel, your men in Chalk 4 are still alive. I'm going to make sure they stay that way." She didn't wait for a reply. She released the button, cutting him off. She pushed the throttles forward. The twin General Electric engines spooled up, their deep roar escalating to a piercing shriek. The Warthog surged down the runway, a blind brute charging into oblivion. The crosswind was immense, a physical hand trying to shove the 20-ton aircraft off the tarmac. Eva's feet danced on the rudder pedals, making constant, minute adjustments, keeping the nose pointed straight into the abyss. The numbers on her HUD climbed. 80 knots, 100, 120. "You're out of runway, Major." Cole's voice was tight with alarm. She pulled back on the stick. The aircraft felt heavy, sluggish, the air thick and dense with sand. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed to refuse, to settle back onto its wheels. Then, with a final, shuddering groan, the wheels left the ground. She was airborne. The moment she cleared the ground, the storm hit her with its full, unholy fury. The A-10 was thrown sideways, dropping 50 feet in an instant. Alarms blared in the cockpit, stall warnings, engine pressure alerts, proximity alarms. The airframe groaned in protest, the wings flexing under loads they were never designed to handle. It felt less like flying and more like being inside a tin can kick down a gravel road. But inside the chaos, Eva was an island of calm. Her eyes scanned her instruments, ignoring the cacophony of warnings. Her focus was on two things: the attitude indicator and the engine temperature gauges. The sand was a superheated abrasive, and it was trying to choke her engines to death. She eased the throttles back slightly, finding a delicate balance between power and preservation. She wasn't climbing. She was flying parallel to the ground, at an altitude of just 300 feet. She was inside the storm, underneath the densest layer. The HUD was useless, showing only a swirling brown void. Her world was the green glow of the instruments: airspeed, altitude, heading. She was a navigator in a submarine, trusting her charts in a world without light. She flew by the numbers she had memorized from the TOC: the heading to the wadi, the distance, the elevation of the surrounding terrain. In the TOC, Madsen stared at the single icon that had detached itself from the FOB on the tactical map. It was moving at 250 knots directly toward Chalk 4's last known position. "Who is that?" he demanded again, his voice now laced with a terrifying mix of fury and awe. "Who the hell is in that plane?" Cole's voice, patched through from the flight line comms, was quiet but clear, cutting through the stunned silence of the command center. "That's Hog 7, sir. Major Rostova." Eva was flying through a canyon of pure turbulence. The aircraft bucked and yawed, the stick fighting her with a life of its own. Her body was braced, her muscles tight, absorbing the violent shocks. She was counting down the distance in her head. 5 miles. 4. 3. She was approaching the ridgeline that boxed in the wadi. According to the map, it rose to 600 feet. She was too low. She couldn't climb. The particle density above her would kill her engines. She had to trust the map. She had to trust the corridor she had seen in the data. There was a notch in the ridge, a slight dip. It was her only way in. Flying on instruments alone, she banked the aircraft, a gut-wrenching turn in zero visibility, aiming for a point in space she could not see. The ground proximity warning system screamed a solid, unending tone. The synthetic voice repeated, "Pull up, pull up, pull up." She ignored it. Her eyes were locked on the radar altimeter. 200 feet. 150. 100. The right wingtip felt like it was about to scrape the unseen rock wall. The aircraft shuddered violently as it passed through the turbulent air spilling over the ridge. And then, for a single, breathtaking second, the world resolved itself. She burst through the curtain of sand into the relative clarity of the wadi. The storm still raged above, a ceiling of churning brown, but here, protected by the canyon walls, visibility improved to a few hundred yards. Below her, the scene was a hellscape. The battle was laid out like a diorama of desperation. The surviving members of Chalk 4 were huddled behind a rock formation, their position marked by the frantic blinking of an infrared strobe. They were surrounded. Enemy fighters, dozens of them, were swarming down the slopes of the wadi, closing in for the kill. A technical, a pickup truck with a heavy DSHK machine gun bolted to the bed, was methodically chewing up the soldiers' cover, spitting tracers that ricocheted off the rocks in angry sparks. Eva had less than 3 seconds. Her thumb flicked the master arm switch to on. Her other hand was already guiding the stick, rolling the A-10 onto its side. She didn't have time for a targeting pod lock. This was manual. This was instinct. She aligned the pipper on the HUD directly with the muzzle flash of the technical's gun. The aircraft screamed over the battlefield at less than 200 feet, a terrifying, wraith-like apparition materializing from the storm. On the ground, Staff Sergeant Renner, Chalk 4's leader, thought he was hallucinating. He heard a sound that was not the wind or the gunfire, a sound that ripped the air in two. He looked up and saw the impossible. The brutal, ugly silhouette of a warthog, its nose canted down, its wings almost vertical. It was so close he could see the rivets on its belly. Eva squeezed the trigger. The Gu-8 Avenger cannon spoke. It wasn't the sound of a gun. It was the sound of a god clearing his throat. A cataclysmic BRRT that lasted only a single second. 300 rounds of 30 mm high-explosive incendiary armor-piercing shells erupted from the nose of the aircraft. For that 1 second, the A-10 was a flying volcano. A line of explosions, brighter than magnesium flares, stitched across the wadi floor, walking directly from the dirt to the technical. The truck didn't just explode. It ceased to exist. One moment it was there, a nexus of death, and the next it was a cloud of vaporized metal and fire. The shockwave hit Renner's position like a physical blow, and the deafening roar of the cannon was replaced by the even more deafening roar of the Warthog's engines as Eva pulled up, banking hard and vanishing back into the wall of sand at the far end of the wadi. The effect was instantaneous. The enemy fighters, who had been pressing their attack with impunity, faltered. They stared at the burning crater where the technical had been, then looked up at the brown, empty sky where the demon had vanished. The relentless pressure on Chalk 4 evaporated. In the TOC, the audio feed from Renner's comms, which had been a stream of panicked reports and pained cries, suddenly crackled with a single, breathless word. Jesus! Madsen stared at the map. The red icons near Chalk 4's position had scattered. They were no longer advancing. They were disorganized, confused. Ikita's mic, his voice tight. Hog 7, this is Apex Command. Report your status. Eva's voice came back, impossibly calm, punctuated only by the soft hiss of her oxygen. Apex, this is Hog 7. I am on station. Chalk 4, talk to me. Mark your targets. The spell of shock on the ground broke. Renner grabbed his radio. Hog 7. This is Chalk 4. We have enemy concentration on the eastern slope. Coordinates. Screw the coordinates. They're 200 meters east of our position. Dug in behind the rocks. Copy that, Chalk 4. Eva replied. Stay down. She was already turning. A tight, high-G maneuver that pushed her deep into her seat. She flew a racetrack pattern using the confines of the wadi itself. She would dive out of the storm at one end, make her pass, and then disappear back into the sand at the other, using the storm as a cloak. The enemy never knew where she was coming from. The initial shock of the A-10's appearance quickly wore off, replaced by a desperate, reactive fury from the enemy on the ground. They had been on the verge of annihilating Chalk 4, and now this phantom from the sky had stolen their victory. They adapted. Realizing the pilot was using the storm for cover, they began firing blindly into the brown haze. Green and red tracers from AK-47s and PKMs stitched frantically across the sky, a chaotic web of light searching for a target. Then came the RPGs. Insurgents on the high ground of the wadi slopes began launching rocket-propelled grenades in coordinated volleys, not aiming at the aircraft they couldn't see, but saturating the airspace where they thought it might be. In Eva's cockpit, the world was a deadly lottery. An RPG warhead streaked past her canopy, so close she could see the crude fins on its tail. It detonated 100 feet behind her, the concussion slapping the A-10's tail and yawing the aircraft violently. Hog 7. They're firing RPGs all over the sky. Renner yelled over the radio. You're drawing everything they've got. That's the point, Chalk 4. Eva's voice returned, still unervingly steady. Keeps them from shooting at you. I see a mortar team setting up on the northern ridge. I'm going to take them out. In the TOC, Colonel Madsen was leaning over the communications console, listening to the exchange with an expression of raw disbelief. His entire command philosophy was built on control, on information, on mitigating risk. This pilot, this Major Rostova, was operating in a sphere so far beyond acceptable risk it defied classification. Yet she was succeeding. Get me a direct link to her, Madsen ordered the tech. No relays. I want to talk to her myself. The tech fumbled with the console. Sir, her transponder is intermittent. The storm. It's hard to get a clean signal lock. Then try harder. Madsen snapped. His anger wasn't directed at the tech. It was the last vestige of his crumbling authority. He was no longer in command of this battle. He was a spectator. A new voice cut in on the command channel, calm and professional. It was the weapons officer from the Spectre gunship, still orbiting helplessly at 20,000 feet. Apex Command, this is Spectre 1-1. We are picking up flashes through the undercast. It looks like an A-10 is engaging targets directly below us. Can you confirm you have a friendly asset in the kill box? We can confirm, Spectre, Madsen replied, his voice strained. Stand by to assist if a window opens. Roger, Apex. We'll keep watch. But, Command, whoever is flying that bird is either the best pilot I have ever heard of or the craziest. The wind shear down there should have ripped his wings off by now. Eva ignored the chatter. She had her next target. The mortar team was clever, nestled in a small rock alcove that shielded them from a direct frontal attack. A straight gun run was impossible. She would have to come in high, drop down almost vertically, and pull out in meters. It was a textbook maneuver for a clear day. In this storm, with the wind trying to tear the plane apart, it was suicide. She climbed, pushing the A-10 back up into the thickest part of the sandstorm. The world outside the canopy vanished completely. The noise intensified to a physical vibration that rattled her teeth. The engine temperature needles crept toward the red line. She was counting in her head, flying a precise, three-dimensional pattern in her mind. Now, she rolled the aircraft inverted and pulled the stick back, diving nose first into the wadi. She burst out of the storm cloud directly above the mortar position. The ground rushed up at her with terrifying speed. The enemy fighters looked up, their faces masks of shock. They had been watching the ends of the wadi, not the sky directly above them. She didn't use the gun. Her thumb selected the cluster bombs. At 500 feet, she pickled the release. The CBU-97 canister fell away from the aircraft. At 300 feet, she pulled the stick back into her lap, her G-suit inflating, crushing her legs and torso as the A-10 clawed its way out of the dive. The aircraft shuddered, screaming in protest at the 7G turn. For a moment, the ground filled her entire canopy. The ground proximity alarm was a solid, unending shriek. Behind her, the CBU canister opened, releasing a swarm of smaller bomblets. They rained down on the mortar position, a steel cloud of death that turned the entire ridgeline into a churning inferno of secondary explosions. The mortar team and the fighters around them were gone. The enemy's assault broke. It was no longer an attack. It was a rout. Fighters who had been pressing forward were now scrambling for cover, abandoning their positions, trying to melt back into the landscape. They weren't fighting soldiers anymore. They were fighting a vengeful spirit that could strike from any direction, at any time. Valkyrie, you are Winchester on 30 mil. Cole's voice cut into her private channel, a stark reminder of reality. Winchester, out of ammunition for the main gun. Copy, Cole, she replied. Still have the Mavs. Madsen's voice finally broke through the static, clear and direct. Hog 7, this is Madsen. What is your status, Major? Status is green, Colonel, Eva said. The immediate threat to Chalk 4 has been neutralized. What are your orders? The question hung in the air. The shift in dynamic was absolute. He was no longer ordering her. She was asking him for a mission. Madsen looked at the tactical map, at the scattered red icons, at the steady blue chevron of Chalk 4. He looked at the faces of his staff, who were all staring at him, waiting. He had been dismissed, and now he was in command. Your orders, Madsen said, his voice devoid of its earlier arrogance, are to get those men out of there. The wadi walls were her shield and her cage. Eva had broken the enemy's main assault, but Chalk 4 was still trapped. One of their men, a private named Miller, had taken shrapnel to the leg and couldn't move on his own. The enemy was no longer a cohesive force, but they had become something almost as dangerous. Pockets of panicked, angry fighters hiding among the rocks. They were taking potshots, trying to suppress the American soldiers and prevent any attempt at extraction. The route back to the FOB was a 1,000-meter gauntlet. Apex, this is Chalk 4. Renner's voice crackled. Steadier now but still tight. We need to move Miller. We can't stay here. Can you clear a path for us along the western wall? Hog 7, you copy that? Madsen asked. It was no longer a commander talking to a subordinate. It was one professional to another. I copy, Eva replied. The western wall is tight. I'll be danger close. Chalk 4, you need to hug that wall like it's your mother. I'm going to be walking my fire right alongside you. Acknowledge. We acknowledge, Hog 7, Renner said, a note of awe in his voice. We trust you. Trust. Eva felt the weight of that word. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the terrain on her brief passes. The western wall of the wadi was a sheer cliff face on one side and a broken field of boulders on the other, perfect ambush territory. She would have to fly her A-10 in a way it was never meant to be flown, not as a bomber but as a close-in bodyguard. She descended, bringing the Warthog down until her radar altimeter flickered between 80 and 100 feet. She was now flying below the rim of the wadi, using the canyon itself as a tunnel. The air was thick with rotor wash from her own engines, kicking up immense plumes of dust that further obscured the view. The tips of her wings felt inches from the rock walls. This wasn't flying. It was threading a needle in a hurricane. Chalk 4, on my mark, you move, Eva commanded. I'm coming in from the south. I will make my first pass in 10 seconds. Move on the sound of my engines. Mark, now. She pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 accelerated down the narrow corridor. Her targeting pod, now partially effective in the lower dust, painted heat signatures on her MFD. Friendlies were clustered blue blobs. Hostiles were stark white, hiding behind the rocks ahead of the soldier's path. She had no gun ammo. It was time for the Mavericks. She selected a missile, the seeker head locking onto the heat signature of a heavy machine gun nest 100 meters ahead of Chalk 4's intended path. The missile lock tone chirped in her ear. She was too close for a standard launch. The missile's arming time might not be met before impact. She overrode the safety. Fox 2, she murmured, and squeezed the trigger. The AGM-65 Maverick leaped from its pylon with a sharp kick. It was a fire-and-forget weapon, but at this range, she watched it all the way in. The missile streaked across the short distance and slammed into the rock emplacement. The resulting explosion was surgical, a contained blast of fire and shrapnel that vaporized the target without sending debris anywhere near Chalk 4's position. On the ground, Renner and his men, carrying the wounded Miller on a makeshift stretcher, began their desperate sprint. The sound of the A-10's engines was a deafening, comforting roar just over their heads. They could feel the heat of its passage. Eva pulled up, banked hard against the wadi wall in a maneuver that defied physics, and reversed course, coming back from the north. The enemy, recovering from the missile strike, began firing again. Tracers reached for the soldiers. Eva saw a team with an RPG taking aim at the retreating squad. She was out of position for another missile run. She had only one option. She rolled the aircraft, aligning her nose with the RPG team. She was flying directly at them and directly at Chalk 4, who were between her and the target. Her thumb moved from the weapons select to the countermeasures panel. She hit the flare release button, not once, but 5 times in rapid succession. A brilliant shower of magnesium flares erupted from the back of the A-10. They weren't for decoying a missile. They were offensive. The incandescent balls of fire, burning at thousands of degrees, rained down directly on the RPG team. The effect was terrifying. The fighters screamed, dropping their weapon to shield their eyes from the blinding light and beat at their clothing as it began to smolder. The RPG fired wildly into the sky, its operator momentarily blinded. It was a move straight out of a long-forgotten experimental tactics manual, a chapter from a program codenamed Icarus, a program that had tested the absolute limits of both pilot and airframe, developing unconventional ways to use every system on the aircraft. A program her father had died in. Keep moving, Chalk 4. Eva commanded, her voice tight from the G-forces of her turn. I'll keep them busy. She made 2 more passes, one with another perfectly placed maverick that sealed the mouth of a cave insurgents were firing from, and a final, terrifyingly low pass where she used nothing but the sound and fury of her presence. She flew directly over the remaining enemy positions at 50 feet. The sheer noise of the twin engines at full throttle, funneled by the canyon walls, was a weapon in itself. It was a physical assault of sound that stunned and disoriented, breaking the last of their will to fight. The ground fell silent. Hog 7, they're clear. Renner's voice came over the radio, breathless and choked with emotion. They're inside the wire. All men accounted for. You did it. You absolute goddamn angel. You did it. Eva felt a slow, controlled release of the tension that had held her rigid for the last 30 minutes. Her fuel light was blinking. The engine temperature warnings were no longer amber. They were a steady, ominous red. The old warrior beneath her had given everything it had. Copy that, Chalk 4, she said, her voice finally showing a trace of weariness. Good to hear. Hog 7 is RTB. She pointed the nose of the warthog toward the southern end of the wadi, climbing gently back into the embrace of the storm. The relative calm of the canyon vanished, replaced once more by the violent, blind chaos of the sand. She was alone again, with only her instruments and the groaning protests of her battered aircraft for company. The battle was over. Chalk 4 was safe. The ground attack on FOB Apex had been broken, its momentum shattered by a single, impossible flight. On the command net, a wave of stunned, jubilant chatter erupted. Voices from the perimeter walls confirmed the enemy was in full retreat. The Spectre gunship pilot came on the radio again, his professional comm broken. Apex Command, I have never, ever seen flying like that. Who is that pilot? Colonel Madsen stood before the main tactical display, which was now blessedly free of encroaching red icons. The single icon of Hog 7 was crawling slowly back toward the base, its track wavering slightly. He knew the aircraft was hurt. He turned to his aide. Get me Major Rostova's full service record. Not the transit file. The real one. I want it now. The aide, a young lieutenant, fumbled with his datapad. Sir, most of it is classified. Redacted at the highest level. Unredact it, Madsen ordered, his voice quiet but absolute. A few moments later, the file appeared on Madsen's private screen. He scanned it, his eyes moving quickly down the page. Eva Rostova, top of her class at the Air Force Academy. Distinguished graduate of flight school. But then the record went dark for 5 years. There was only a single cryptic project name, Project Icarus below that, a list of commendations all sealed. And then, at the bottom, a single entry, callsign Valkyrie. The name clicked into place with the force of a revelation. Valkyrie. It wasn't a pilot's barroom nickname. It was a legend, a ghost story whispered by grizzled NCOs and veteran pilots. A pilot who flew obsolete planes in impossible conditions during Black Ops missions that never officially happened. A pilot who had racked up a kill count in an A-10 that was rumored to be higher than any single F-22 pilot. A pilot who had supposedly vanished years ago. Madsen looked up from the screen. He understood now. He hadn't dismissed a ferry pilot. He had dismissed a living legend. He had sent her to the officers' mess while his men were dying. The shame of it was a cold weight in his gut. He keyed the command channel, his voice formal. All stations, this is Apex Command. Cease non-essential chatter. Maintain vigilance, he paused. Then switched to the direct channel to the A-10. Valkyrie, this is Madsen. Report your fuel state. The use of the call sign was a deliberate act of acknowledgement. It was an apology and a mark of respect, all contained in a single word. Fuel state is critical, Eva's voice replied, calm as ever. But I'll make it home. The landing was almost as harrowing as the takeoff. With one engine overheating and the airframe battered, the A-10 approached the runway like a wounded bird. The crosswind was still ferocious. Eva had to fly the final approach almost sideways, crabbing the aircraft against the wind, before kicking the rudder at the last possible second to align with the tarmac. The landing gear hit the runway hard, but they held. The battered Warthog rolled down the runway and slowly, painfully, taxied back toward its revetment, a trail of hydraulic fluid marking its path. As the canopy hissed open, the roar of the storm rushed back in. But it was different now. It was just wind and sand. The malice was gone. Eva sat for a long moment in the cockpit, the silence of the powered-down instruments a stark contrast to the preceding hour of chaos. She ran a gloved hand over the instrument panel, a silent thank you. Then she unstrapped and climbed down the ladder. Sergeant Cole was there, waiting. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, then at the aircraft. The Warthog was a mess. It was scoured down to bare metal in places, its skin pockmarked by debris. An antenna was sheared off. A smear of black marked where the RPG had detonated near the tail. He walked over and placed a hand on the fuselage, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. This plane would never fly again. Eva walked over to him. He met her gaze, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, unspoken understanding. Eva nodded back. It was all that was needed between them. A vehicle pulled up, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Colonel Madsen stepped out. He walked toward Eva, his face unreadable in the swirling dust. The ground crews, who had emerged from their shelters to stare at the returned ghost, fell silent. They expected a confrontation, a dressing down for the unsanctioned flight. Madsen stopped directly in front of Eva. He was a tall man, but in that moment, she seemed to tower over him. He looked at her, then at the savaged machine behind her, and then back at her. He didn't speak. Instead, he brought his hand up in a slow, precise salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer. It was the salute of a soldier to a warrior, a sign of ultimate respect, earned in blood and fire. Eva returned the salute, her own movement just as crisp, just as clean. They held it for a long second, an entire conversation passing between them in the silence. Finally, Madsen lowered his hand. "Your report, Major," he said, his voice quiet, formal. "On my desk." In the morning, he turned and walked back to his vehicle without another word. The reprimand would never come. Her file would be quietly updated, the mission buried in the same black ink that covered the rest of her career. Eva lowered her own hand and turned away from him, back toward the A-10. She walked to the nose of the aircraft, to the spot she had wiped clean before the flight. With the grime scoured away by the storm, the painted Valkyrie was clearer now. Her spear pointed forward, her wings spread. Eva placed her palm flat against the cold metal, her fingers tracing the outline of the faded figure. The engines ticked and groaned as they cooled, the only sounds beside the endless, indifferent wind. She had been dismissed as a relic, flying a machine destined for scrap. But in the crucible of the storm, both she and the old Warthog had reminded everyone what true legends were made of. Her dignity, like the titanium hull of her cockpit, remained intact. She stood there for a long time, a silent guardian watching over her fallen steed, as the dust of the Shamal settled around them. The following morning, the storm had passed. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the air scrubbed clean. The damage to the FOB was evident everywhere. Torn shelters, buried equipment, a fine layer of sand over everything. But the base was secure. The mood was not one of celebration, but of quiet, exhausted relief. In the makeshift hangar where Hog 7 had been towed, a team of maintenance evaluators was already at work. Their voices were low and clinical. Catastrophic stress fractures along the wing roots, turbine blades on both engines are shredded, hydraulic system failure is imminent. The verdict was swift and unanimous. The airframe was a total loss, damaged beyond any possibility of repair. It had given its last flight. Eva stood nearby, watching them, her arms crossed. She had filed her report, a dry, technical account of ordnance expended and maneuvers executed. It contained no emotion, no mention of the impossible odds or the screaming alarms. It was as stoic as she was. Sergeant Cole was there, overseeing the crew as they began the process of safing the aircraft for final decommissioning. He approached her, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "They're writing her off," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't news. It was a eulogy. "She did her job," Eva replied, her gaze fixed on the warthog. "She did more than that, Major," Cole said softly. "She saved 30 men, including the ones in Chalk 4 and the guys on the wire they would have overrun next." He paused. "I heard the chatter this morning. The grunts. They're calling you the ghost of the Wadi? They're already telling the story." Eva's expression didn't change. The legends didn't matter to her. The only thing that mattered was the result. The blue chevrons were safe. The red icons were gone. That was the only validation she ever required. Later that day, Staff Sergeant Renner and the men of Chalk 4, bandaged but alive, came to find her. They found her by the silent A-10. Renner, a tough, career NCO, stood before her. His face etched with a gratitude so profound it left him struggling for words. The young private, Miller, was on crutches, his leg in a cast. "Ma'am," Renner began, his voice rough with emotion. We just wanted to thank you. We were dead. There was no way out. And then you came." Eva looked at them, at their tired, grateful faces. She saw the lives that had been balanced on the edge of a knife, and which she had pulled back. "You would have done the same for me, Sergeant," she said simply. Miller, the young private, pushed himself forward on his crutches. "Ma'am, can I ask, is it true what they say? About your call sign?" Eva held his gaze. "Some stories get taller in the telling, Private." Renner put a hand on Miller's shoulder. "Doesn't matter," he said, looking back at Eva. "We know what we saw. Thank you." He didn't offer a salute or a handshake. He just met her eyes, a look of pure, unvarnished respect passing between the soldier on the ground and the pilot in the sky. It was a bond forged in the heart of the storm. Her orders came through that afternoon. She was being reassigned. Not to a ferry squadron, not to a desk. The orders were heavily encrypted, but Cole, with his knack for finding things, managed to decrypt the destination. A classified base in Nevada, the home of Project Icarus's successor. They weren't decommissioning her. They were bringing her back into the fold. Her flight out was scheduled for dusk. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, Eva did one last walk around of Hog 7. The maintenance crews were gone. The aircraft stood alone, silent and proud even in its broken state. She ran her hand along the barrel of the GU-8, its metal cool to the touch. She walked back to the nose, to the faded painting. She had her orders, a new assignment, a future. But in her mind, a part of her would always be here, in this cockpit, in this storm, with this plane. A shadow fell beside her. It was Colonel Madsen. He stood with her in silence for a moment, both of them looking at the dead aircraft. "They tell me your father flew," he said, his voice quiet. "He was a test pilot," Eva confirmed, her eyes still on the plane. "Project Icarus," Madsen said. It wasn't a question. He pushed an experimental frame past its breaking point. The inquiry said it was pilot error. Eva finally turned to look at him. The inquiry was wrong. He found the edge of the envelope so that pilots like me would know where it was. He didn't fail. He taught. Madsen nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He understood her lineage, not of blood, but of purpose. The instinct, the connection to the machine, the willingness to fly into the storm, it was all inherited. "The official report for yesterday's engagement," he said, "will state that an unidentified aircraft provided timely air support before contact was lost. No further details will be available." "Thank you, sir," Eva said. "No, Major," Madsen corrected her, his voice firm. "Thank you." He gave her one last, brief nod of respect and walked away, leaving her alone with her memories and her legacy. As the C-130 transport that would take her away taxied onto the runway, Eva looked out the small porthole window. She could see the silhouette of Hog 7, standing sentinel in its revetment against the deep purple of the twilight sky, a monument of scarred gray steel. a warrior at rest. The engines of the transport roared to life, and as the plane lifted off the ground, turning west toward a new mission, Eva Rostova did not look back again. The legend of the ghost of the Wadi would remain, a story told in hushed tones around campfires and in dusty briefing rooms, a testament to the quiet, stoic pilot who had flown into the heart of a storm and emerged a savior. The Valkyrie had flown, and that was all that mattered.